Welcome to the Clearly Christian Podcast with Dr. Cy Smith. It's time to know more so you can say no more. It's time for the Clearly Christian Podcast. Here's your host, Dr. Cy Smith.
I'm Dr. Cy Smith, and this is Clearly Christian, a podcast about what it means to see the world from God's perspective and the impact this has for training the next generation to live a life consistent with the biblical worldview. You've been listening and you like what you hear. I hope you'll hit that subscribe button or leave a review. That'll let others know the show's worth checking out, help spread the word, and serve our mission to make a difference. So again, thank you for being here, and thank you for helping us advance the cause of Christian education. I'm excited to talk with Roger Erdvig today about something that will make for a strong and timely episode of the Clearly Christian Podcast. We're drawing attention to the critical state of biblical worldview in our culture and in our classrooms. According to the latest research from Dr. George Barna and the Cultural Research Center at Arizona Christian University, only 4% of American adults currently hold a biblical worldview. The annual study examines worldview across 8 key categories, such as God, creation, history, family, and the value of life. Among baby boomers and Gen X, which is me, about 7% hold the biblical worldview. That number falls to just 2% for millennials, and for Gen Z, it plummets to a staggering 1%. That's only 1 in 100 Americans who are thinking and living biblically. Well, the study doesn't just measure beliefs, it examines whether people are actually living them out. And even among those identifying as Christians, there remains massive gaps in what people believe and how they actually live. Well, for leaders of the faith, this research is a clarion call for the importance of Christian education. This data makes it clearly evident that adults are shaped far more by the culture they consume than by a weekly sermon. Living with a biblical worldview doesn't just happen naturally as a result of accepting Christ. Living as someone who thinks and acts in a way that's patterned after the way Christ thinks and acts takes training, education, and discipleship, especially in today's confusing post-Christian culture. Well, this is the strength of Christian schooling. As I say in every episode, we're training the next generation to live a life consistent with a biblical worldview. But as my guest would contend, and I would agree that the overwhelming research numbers now bear this out, not all biblical worldview training is having the same result on Christian school graduates. Indeed, sometimes we overpromise and underdeliver here. In his breakthrough book, Beyond Biblical Integration, Roger Erdvig asserts that Christian schools settle too often for integration, when what is truly needed is immersion. There's a crucial difference between simply integrating biblical concepts into lessons and truly teaching from a biblical worldview, one that shapes the entire approach, the purpose, and the practice of education. Dr. Erdvig's thesis immediately resonated with me when I read his book because I've long been bothered by the fact that surveys with our teachers and administrators still show that more training in biblical worldview integration is the most in-demand topic for professional development. It's been this way for my entire career. But what are we not doing correctly that this issue still plagues our schools? Are the weight of cultural factors influencing our teachers just too heavy for us to overcome with professional development? Well, does the model for education itself create a barrier to effective integration? Or are we tackling this issue from a faulty paradigm and shifting our perspective from integration to immersion will clear the fog, so to speak? Well, these are the questions we're addressing today and again our conversation with author and speaker Roger Erdvig. Roger serves as the director of the Center for Biblical Worldview Formation at Summit Ministries, the premier biblical worldview training organization in the U.S. He also co-hosts a podcast with Dr. Maggie Pope on worldview education called Teaching Biblically. Roger's written a watershed book for Christian schools that challenges our understanding of integration and has greatly impacted my own thinking on worldview training. In the spring of 25, Roger, alongside author Dr. Maggie Pope, released the Standards for Biblical Worldview Formation, the first ever set of comprehensive pre-K through 12 standards designed to be used alongside academic learning standards to nurture worldview formation across all subjects and grades. And that's just some of what he's doing on a regular basis and what he's involved in. So again, as I mentioned off the air, this is a highlight for me. This has been a couple years in the making, so I'm thrilled today to welcome Dr. Erdvig to the podcast. So welcome, Roger. Thanks for being a part of the show today.
Yeah, thank you so much, Cy, and I cannot wait to have this discussion based on what we've chatted about before.
Awesome. Well, that's great. Well, thank you. Well, let's jump in. Today, I want to talk about making the connection between beliefs and behaviors and how Christian schools may hold the key to cultural renewal, but only if we do this correctly. So let's talk about you and the background even in writing this book, your journey in education, how you arrived at this role, author, speaker, summit. Why is it you do what you do? Introduce us to Roger Erdvig for my listeners out there.
Well, the real genesis of all of the work that I do goes back to, I would say, almost a single incident, but that's probably overstating a little bit. But I want to tell you about this situation where I was in my first head of school position. This was back in 2009. And we had some national level, world-renowned worldview trainers come to our school to help us understand how to do biblical worldview better. So again, like you said, all the way back in 2009, this was a huge concern in schools, as it was in my school. Well, as we're sitting there listening to this speaker, who I won't name because you might know his name, share about biblical worldview and the contours of a worldview and everything that we understand that a biblical worldview is, I raised my hand and asked a question during a Q&A time and that question was along the lines of, hey, given that all of this is true, what difference should that make in how we actually teach in our classrooms? And by that, I mean pedagogy. Like, how should this impact what teachers do on their lesson plans as they're getting ready? Mm-hmm. And this expert who'd written textbooks on biblical worldview said, you know what? I appreciate that question, Roger, but I've never really thought about it. And in that moment, what really ignited in me was this flame or this burning desire to not necessarily figure out what a biblical worldview is, because I think we'd done a pretty good job of that in the evangelical world in the last part of the 20th century. But for me, the desire was, given that this is all true, how should we then teach? And so back, we're pushing 20 years ago, not quite, just over 15, really passionate about that and wanting to explore every avenue I could to figure out how to actually teach from within a biblical worldview, as opposed to just teaching a biblical worldview.
Yeah, exactly. I love that. And there's that whole phrase and concept and idea was one that, like I said, I was reading your book alongside some other books, and that's what really created that spark within me. Oh, man, it just clicked. How do you start there instead of starting from a whole different place? But what were you seeing in education and maybe in a bigger picture that really led to some of those convictions about immersion versus integration, like I said in my opening? That you were just seeing this everywhere you went, or was it just your own experience in the classroom?
Well, I saw it in the church, and really Christian schools are made up of church people, right? Yeah. So during that season of my adult life and ministry and leadership, and even raising 5 kids to know and serve Christ and trying to make our home a biblical worldview development laboratory, I just saw a tremendous lack everywhere I turned of a really robust view of what biblical worldview is, but primarily how it takes shape. And it was as if somewhere along the lines, we decided that the best way to, quote, give a biblical worldview to someone else, which, P.S., I don't think you can actually do that, but we can talk about that later, would be to tell them what's in a biblical worldview and to take current hot-button cultural issues and compare and contrast them with a biblical worldview. Now, all of that is super important. That's really foundational, but it is insufficient for robust and resilient worldview formation. So I saw it in the church. I responded in our own family and how we raised and educated our kids. But then when like I said, in my first head of school position, I was in a school that was very well known, fairly prominent. And there were teachers there, as I would talk about worldview, that didn't even know what the concept worldview was. And so it's kind of this dual thing where we saw that the primary approach of the church to giving a biblical worldview was all about information and truth claims. And then the very teachers who we've entrusted with the mission, the biblical worldview formation mission of our schools, were not conversant in the concept of worldview. So you take those two things and you know what? it really doesn't surprise me that we're at the place that Barna identifies us as being.
Yes, that was my next question, right? Are you surprised that when you hear 4%, it doesn't sound like you're going to be surprised?
No,
that was the connection. Those are pretty low. And like I said, when you hear that 2% and 1%, I mean, that really sent a jolt through me, this last one. We'd been hearing 4% now for a couple of years. But then when he said, hey, that's the average because the boomers are skewing it a little bit, goodness gracious. And I look at Gen Z, and obviously as the head of school, a longtime head of school, I'm built like most leaders. I cannot just let that go by. Yeah. I'm a problem solver. I'm a doer. I say, hey, not on my watch, right? Yes. I mean, I have to remedy this. I cannot watch the biblical worldview fade into extinction while we just watch these numbers plummet. And what do we mean by teaching or living with a biblical worldview? Where's that gap that I'm talking about?
I would love to explore that even, and George Barna is a friend of mine, and I respect his work, and I love what he's doing because he's really helping us. But what I do like to clarify with that is those surveys that he bases his conclusions on are really low-hanging fruit. It's the basics of a biblical worldview. Like Jesus lived a sinless life and provided atonement for our sins. Like some of the most basic non-starter statements about evangelical faith are being compromised that much. So it is, I would say it's even worse than what George Barna says. And I think most of us that are kind of paying attention realize that even like Cy, within our lifetimes, there's been this radical move away from an orthodox biblical worldview. Now, I would suggest that a lot of that gap is because, exactly like we're talking about, in Christian schools and churches and in families, the three core institutions that the Holy Spirit uses in young people's lives to form their spirits to be like Christ, and I say worldview formation is part of that process, but all of them primarily have focused on the transference of information to students and have been content with the students repeating back that information. And then we say, look, so-and-so has a biblical worldview. Look at this great answer they gave on an assessment. Mm-hmm. Well, I think that's really where the gap is, that we don't have a well-rounded enough, a robust enough view of what a worldview actually is, and we've settled for something that's only part, not the whole.
Yeah, you're exactly right. In education, that shows up on those end-of-course surveys or those senior surveys, exit surveys, things like that, where we've taken a host of them, obviously, in my over 30 years at MCS, and sometimes we're shocked by some of the answers. And then we'll go back and talk to the kids about, well, I didn't really understand that verbiage, or like you even said in your example there, using the word atonement. Well, I wasn't quite sure what they meant by atonement, and so I answered this way. Or they've got this ACT, SAT mindset going, well, if I read the word always and never, then it must be false.
Right.
And so they'll look at a question like, life always begins at conception, and say, well, that must be false. Mm-hmm. Wait, do you believe? No, yeah, I believe that. But the way it said always, I figured it must be. We're like, oh, my word, you kids are overthinking it. You're not staying true to who you are. There's all kinds of issues there with some of those exit surveys and some of those things. Because, again, it's been about maybe transference and not necessarily from the inside out. And that's a good segue to my next question. Then you talk in the book about instead of looking at our students in terms of having a strong biblical worldview, which will rest on what they know, then, hey, let's go after a developing worldview. Yeah. Let's camp out there. So maybe explain what you meant by the difference between, the goal being strong versus the goal being developing.
Yeah, we work with a lot of schools on recrafting and evaluating expected student outcomes. And then also we see on, school mission statements on websites and things like that, this idea that when a student walks across the graduation stage at 18, maybe 17 and a half years old, that they have a strongly developed biblical worldview. Or, we graduate students with a strong biblical worldview, able to represent it and defend it in the marketplace of ideas. And I have that memorized because I've seen versions of it in so many different places. Well, it's well-meaning, but I just don't think it's legitimate. I'm in the same, similar generation as you, Si, and my worldview is still being shaped. I'm still growing into the fullness of the beauty of a biblical worldview. And, I don't know too many church elders that really have a well-developed, robust biblical worldview. So why would we think that after just 12 years of schooling, unless we think it's all about the content we've given them, a student would actually have a well-developed biblical worldview at 18? I would say at best, and I'm talking about even my own children, at 18, you got the basics of a biblical worldview, and ideally you have the mechanics and the skills and the desire to continue developing your biblical worldview. So that's why we like to say, we would suggest schools talk about graduating students that have a maturing biblical worldview or a developing instead of developed. And I think that that's faithful. And you'll find out, even as you kind of mentioned earlier, I'm real big on semantics. And I don't think semantics are, quote, just semantics. I think the way we say things really is important. And so if we have this idea that our graduating seniors are going to have a well-developed biblical worldview, that's going to drive everything we do. And we tend to define worldview in that case as the truth propositions that make up a biblical worldview. And yes, we can produce students that can answer those questions correctly on an assessment. But that's not enough for a lifetime of resilient biblical worldview formation. So that's why we really like to make that differentiation and really be content to say, yeah, you know what? They don't graduate with a strong biblical worldview. They graduate with what they need for a lifetime of worldview formation.
Yeah, I love that. I read someplace else, I think I just Googled it actually, because when I read Barna's research, I thought, well, I wonder how many people identify as believers in this country.
Yeah.
And I know it'd be, whatever Google gives me based on some other data, but it was like 62% say they're Christians. And obviously then when we see something like Barna, and you're saying it's even less than that. So let's just say it's that is straight up. So 62% identify, 4% actually live this out. It's probably less than that. And if Gen Z is accurate now, it's down to 1%. So like I said in the opening, massive gaps between what's being played out on an everyday basis. And I've got all kinds of theories about that. I've written and spoken extensively on the nature of work, which I like what Tim Keller has done on that, and how kids just don't have training to integrate their faith with work. But again, if I've never seen that for 12 years and I went to a government school, what do you expect? I've compartmentalized my faith, which we'll come back to already.
Yeah.
But moving
can I jump in there? Something
please.
You said just hits me so much that I think it's a good thing to talk about. We often classify school for kids as, well, this is your work for now. In the future, you'll have another vocation, but right now your vocation is to learn. So think about what we're doing if we haven't truly immersed every subject area in a biblical worldview. We're literally setting kids up for a lifetime of frustration and a feeling that their work doesn't matter to God, because much of their K-12 work had no exploration of the deep connections between a biblical worldview and their subject area. So I just wanted to pick on that for a second.
Oh, I totally agree. Yep, totally agree.
Yeah, you got it. You got it.
Yes, right. And how would I even, if I've never experienced that, how would I go into that job? This is a quote unquote secular company. This is not a ministry job. How would I even go in there with the first inclination whatsoever to say, here's the biblical worldview on this?
Zero chance,
right? No chance.
Zero chance.
And yet this person might love the Lord.
Absolutely, and they do. Right.
What they do. That's exactly right. Yeah. So are the cultural factors from your perspective, like I said, are they just too powerful for us to overcome with professional development when it comes to our teachers? Or can we approach this maybe from a different perspective, like changing the actual strategy like you mentioned?
Well, here we go again. Here's what I would say. Depending on how you define professional development. I would agree wholeheartedly if you would have added some clarifying words, like with how we've always done professional development. I think the cultural pressures are absolutely enormous because they're not just pressures like to lead people into sin, which indeed they do. They're really pressures to look at life and live from within a radically different story that shapes desires, thoughts, and habitual ways. And the surrounding culture is doing a phenomenal job of nurturing its brand of desires, thoughts, and ways of being for the rising generations. So if we're going to meet that challenge, we can't make our professional development about only one part of it, like the cognitive domain. We can't even do that with our teachers, which we're saying to not do with our students. You see, much of professional development is really about giving teachers more information, and thereby we continually reinforce a system that has not produced real generations of rising young Christian leaders who have a well-developed or well-developing biblical worldview. So I do think that if we don't change the way we do PD, yes, we are going to continue to get steamrolled by the culture who's doing it much better than we are.
Yeah, no, totally agree. Yeah, and like yourself, having done this for over 3 decades, there's not too much PD I haven't sat through. And you're exactly right. And boy, changing that whole paradigm. And maybe PD needs to go, obviously, where we're going next, the difference between integration and immersion. And I love those ideas, and I hope you were the first that coined that term, because I think it's crucial for schools. And I love that idea, and you just alluded it to that. Don't forget, everywhere else in government schools, they are immersed in a worldview. Right. And they have no trouble immersing their students in a worldview. It's everywhere around them. So explain that if you would.
Yeah, so integration is the idea that two things are disintegrated or are separate, and our work as teachers is to somehow bring them back together.
Yeah.
I think that's built on a faulty definition of some words and a faulty concept of what has actually happened, because you can't help but have God's truth fully immersing everything. You may be unaware of it, but your awareness of it or not does not determine the truth of it being there. So I prefer the term immersion because it suggests the way things actually are. I think it's a more truthful statement about what we're doing with our students. Literally, you can't reintegrate something that hasn't been disintegrated. So our thinking has to be, and I love that you've picked up on some of these, like living from within a biblical worldview. And I say that intentionally as opposed to people will ask the question, well, how do you live out a biblical worldview? I'd say, I don't want to live it out. I want to be in it and let it immerse everything I do, from my home life to my church life to my school life to, all those things. So it really requires us as educators and leaders to change some of our language, and sometimes that can be annoying to ourselves and to the folks we work with, to be real sticklers about how we talk about things. But to me, that's really the starting place of recognizing that everything is already immersed in the reality and presence of God. It's my job to explore connections, not make them. And that's really kind of the mind shift for teachers.
And as I said, everywhere the child looks at a government school, God has been intentionally removed. And, we'll blame that on the government, and we'll just say, well, we have a separation of church and state, which is a faulty argument. But we'll go ahead and blame that on the government and say, well, we just can't bring religion in here. We're not going to bring in this person, that person, God included. So I'm immersed in this secular worldview. So I have no problem with understanding life without God. He's not relevant to my math. He's not relevant to my science, history, anything like that. So like you said, so when I graduate, I go into the working world. Maybe I take that STEM degree or IT degree into that computer company. I've never connected God, anything I've ever done K-12. So why would I start now?
Right.
Just because I've been a believer since age 7.
I agree. And I believe that Christian schools are ideally suited. And this to me is an apologetic for Christian schools that we need to hear, because there's a whole lot of reason people are going to Christian schools now, post-COVID. Yeah. And really the apologetic for Christian schools is that we are uniquely designed, uniquely commissioned to be the place where students explore the connections between God's truth and how their subject matter plays out. My question and I love to ask this question, where else are kids going to get that? Now, I do not want to usurp the role of the church in being God's intended venue for the spiritual formation of students. I totally get that.
Yeah.
But I have never, maybe I shouldn't say never. I have only a very minuscule number of times actually heard a teaching or a sermon that helped me explore the glory of God through physics.
Yeah.
It just doesn't happen. And they're not equipped to do it. They're not structured to do it. I've never heard a pastor talk about grammar from within a biblical worldview. I've never heard him talk about foreign language and why it's so important to learn them to bring shalom to the nations. You just don't hear about that. And I get it. Their agenda is pretty rigorous, and they got a set of things for discipleship and spiritual formation that they have to do. So we're leaving this whole area of learning the skills and dispositions and desires to look at everything from within a biblical worldview to absolute chance. And so that's why I think Christian schools and apologetic for Christian schools is nowhere else. Now, some families that homeschool can do this well, depending on the curriculum they use and what understanding they have of God's glory and his work in all the different subject areas. But just imagine here in Christian schools, I don't know how many teachers you have there. Maybe a Christian school has an average of 40 to 80 teachers, right? Just think about the possibility if you had 40 to 80 experts in living within a biblical worldview in the context of their subject area. Yeah. Just imagine how we would prepare young people to live out vocation in the most fruitful and fulfilling ways possible.
Yeah, because what that has led to now, having done this the wrong way for generations, or at least not at all, if you say government school, not at all, and in some Christian schools, maybe the wrong way, we've led to this two-track mentality. And talk to us about what that is, and then how that plays itself out in society at large.
We have inadvertently contributed to the very problem that is the bane of the church's existence, in my view. And so here's how I like to look at it. Most people my age, I'm 56, most people my age, a little younger than me and a little older than me, who go to church, live with the gnawing sense of guilt that they're not in ministry.
Yeah.
And I put that in quotes. Again, let's define our terms. And they feel less than. They feel like their workday world is just so that they can, develop money to give to the church, and that's their spiritual act of worship. Yeah. Not seeing that everything they do is immersed in God's good grace. So we've actually contributed to that by presenting to our students a two-track route for their academic lives. There's the spiritual track that includes chapel, Bible class, small group, spiritual emphasis week, which is just such a crazy term for something. Like, this is the week we're going to emphasize spiritual things. Like, what does that mean? All these things, retreats, camps, all these things, we click into spiritual mode and we go do it. And then it's back to work in the classroom. And here's how I know that it's true. If you look on, I would say 99% of the assessments that teachers gives and the assignments in Christian schools. And I know, I am literally, me and my team, we're in 300 to 400 classrooms a year in part of the work we do at Summit. We're seeing exactly what's going on in the best Christian schools across the country. When I go to a classroom and a teacher says, sorry, there's nothing to see, I'm just giving an assessment, I say, oh, there is much to see. Can I see the assessment? I almost never see anything on the assessment that would require students to, in an articulate and well thought out way, explore the connections between God's truth and their subject area. And I'm not talking about spiritual truths. I'm talking about all truth is God's truth, and to overtly identify that it is such. I almost never see it on assessments. So we are literally, like I said at the opening of this little portion here, we're inadvertently contributing to the bane of the church's existence, and that's a church full of people that don't feel like they're actually kingdom citizens from Monday to Friday. And it's because we train them that way if they happen to go to a Christian school.
Yeah, that is so true. And I've talked to more and more pastors over the years that believe my people are just surviving from week to week because the culture is strong, and they really don't see any connection between what they do for a living and their faith. They've never been trained, like you said, and boy, heaven forbid that be also true of the Christian school graduate, because that's that distinctive opportunity that you were talking about. Keeping religion as a private opinion, keeping it to yourself, I think that is the impetus right now, or at least it was the driver for years and years of American education. I think that the system is designed for that because it was designed to kind of intentionally removed religion, which you and I have talked about. I just wanted to get your thoughts on that as well, to say not only are we at fault in creating that type of mentality in Christian schools when we don't do it properly, that is starting from that correct place. But then, we're also fighting against a culture and a citizenry that has intentionally been educated not to go there.
It's almost as if there's a conspiracy.
Right.
It's almost as if there's some intelligence behind all this.
Yeah.
As I read scripture, and I hear this more and more, especially in our postmodern or post-meta-modern culture right now, a lot of Christians are really backing off from the warfare ethos of our faith because it's just not popular anymore. Warfare requires one person to be saying I'm right and the other person's wrong, and I need to deal with this. And so in our culture, even our Christian culture, we've backed off from that. But the reason I'm saying that is because if you're going to be effective in warfare, and I've read some books about this, I've read some Marine manuals on war fighting and things like that. You know what is common to all of it? You have to know your enemy's strategy. I mean, that's common to business, right? It's just so ironic that we sit around boardrooms talking in business about what our, quote, enemy, we call them competitors, might be doing and what's their plans and how do we head that off at the pass so that we can come out on top. Well, that's the same thing in actual warfare. And because Paul, David, all throughout Scripture, our faith is put into this framework of warfare, which, if it is truly that, then it suggests that there is an opposing strategy that is being used against us to earn that opposing strategist's victory. So that's why I just say, this is all not happenstance. This is all part of a coordinated effort of the kingdom of God against the kingdom of darkness, certainly not equal adversaries. But while we live in this in-between stage of the is of our existence and the story we live, we know there is a battle for the souls of our kids and our own souls. And we also know there are specific strategies and plans that the organizing intelligence of that alternate way of viewing the world is using against us. So you can plot it literally from the late 1800s, some would say back to the 1700s in our country, of this move away from a robust public living within a biblical worldview story and making it the private story that we read at home by ourselves. So it's a concerted effort to rob us of our kingdom destiny.
Yeah, and for the non-education person out there, they might say, well, what does that look like? I mean, I understand you're talking about a system. You're talking about, I'm sure, some bureaucracy to some degree. I mean, this massive government entity that's been created.
Yep.
Can you give me some examples of how that works against biblical worldview? I don't get it because we just leave it alone. We don't touch it. So how is that a problem?
Yeah. Well, it comes in so many different ways. And you talked about earlier the idea of how the public school system right now is really immersed in a non-God worldview, which essentially says the story that we live does not include any chapters that relate to God. And we are writing our own story. Well, that comes across everywhere. It comes across in the curriculum. It comes across in the teacher preparation programs. It comes across in the HR policies of every public school, that you can do just about anything except for say God has something to say about this story. And so there's this concerted result in the entire American educational system. Now, here's a real subtle shift in American education. And this is a subtle shift that we need to think very carefully about here in our nation's 250th anniversary. When we read the Declaration of Independence and we read the pursuit of happiness, we understand from a classical perspective when Jefferson wrote that as a fundamental right for human beings given by God, he was using the word happiness, and this will make sense to education in a second, in a classical Greek sense of happiness, which actually I wish it had been the word virtue, because that's really what it meant. So we are free. We are endowed by our Creator with a right to pursue a life of virtue. Now, what is a life of virtue? It's a life of moral integrity and a commitment to the common good and to building up others. That is what American education, American church, American society was all about. Were there exceptions? Yes. Were there systemic things that were not about others but about ourselves? Absolutely. But in general, our founding documents, our founding fathers were creating a nation, devising a government that understood human nature and the pitfalls there, and had as its ideal life a life of others-focused virtue. I would propose that education has become the most self-centered enterprise
Yeah.
in the world. Now, that might be an extreme statement, but if you think about it, in the warp and woof of what goes on in schools, it's all about my grades, my opportunities, my awards, my SAT score, my chances to get into the best college. Education has morphed from the preparation process to do, as what I would say Ephesians chapter 2:10 tells us to do the good works that God prepared in advance for us to do. That's what education is all about, preparing us to do those good works that God already set up for us to do. And we've flipped it on its head and said education now is all about me. And I think that's really the core of where we've gone askew, going from a others-focused life, a life of moral integrity and submission to God's providence and the creator of the universe. We've morphed that over the 250 years to be all about me.
Right, right. And then we wonder why when kids go down that path and they try to find, as we're told now, the authentic self, find your truth, what works for you, and you pursue those things all the way to their limits. And these kids believe, like you said, that it's all about them and themselves. They want, they're left empty. What? This didn't work. Where do I go now? Now I'm depressed because I chased after everything that I wanted, like I was told to, and I was told just to pick one of these truth options. So I did, and that left me unfulfilled. Now I'm, like I said, I'm really struggling. Maybe I should change my identity. I even question my own, biology, and maybe that'll help me out a little bit. And we wonder, how do we get in this situation? Well, like I said, when you live that life, like you said, that's focused only on you and your quote unquote happiness, and whatever you decide will be fulfilling and truthful for you, and you take away any sort of objective morality or absolutes, boy, we're reaping what we've sown in that case. And that's exactly, like you said, what it was designed to do from the very outset. You can't take God out completely and say everything will be just fine. I mean, that's the understatement of the year.
Right.
But we're watching this play out, and they've succeeded beyond what any of them probably ever thought was possible. Are you able to cite some examples of schools that have really grabbed a hold of what you're out there talking about and said, boy, there's a school that, maybe they're not 100% of their staff, but they are really an immersion-based school or program or faculty?
Yeah. One of the things we, my colleague and I do at Summit, Dr. Maggie Pope, you mentioned her in the introductory material there. One of the things we do is work with schools, multi-year custom partnerships to help them evaluate everything that's important to them as a school and see how it relates to their core mission of worldview formation of their students. And so we've been doing this for a couple of years, and we have schools that I would say either desire to or are becoming exemplar schools of taking all of this theory we've discussed and bringing it to what are we doing in the first grade classroom to address that. And that's what I love about our work. This is not some broad theoretical idea that all the teachers clap for and then they go back to their classroom and say, I have no clue how to do this. Literally, we've learned some ways to translate these theories into very specific things that every teacher in every subject area, every custodian, every front desk receptionist, every athletic coach, and that's a whole other hot button issue, every person who is put before the students as a deliverer of the school's mission can actually do. So there's a school in Minnesota, my real good friend, Jake Mulvihill leads that school. We've been working with them for a long time. And they are doing a phenomenal, long-term, careful, well-reasoned, well-planned job of literally transforming how they do education. And they've been willing to put the time, effort, and resources into doing it, and they are taking their time. This is not a quick fix, Si. This is not, hey, read this book, do this thing, and we're going to be changed. This really is a long-term refocusing. And I would say they're one of the most prominent schools right now that's doing it. But there are a number of schools that we've worked with that are in that process. And here's what I'd love to hear. I'm hearing this more and more. Schools are saying, we put in our turf field, we put in our fine arts department, we did our new STEM lab, we did our aeronautics program. But what are we doing for our core mission? And making sure that really is the core. So more and more schools are saying, Roger, how can we become the model school for biblical worldview immersion? and they are committing the resources to doing it. It's showing up on strategic plans now, and it's showing up on classroom and lobby walls. That's what's their most important thing. So there's a lot of up and coming schools that I'm going to be able to point to as well.
Good. Yeah, that answered my next question, because I was going to ask you about what kind of feedback you're getting. And I think, if not, when? I mean, how much more do the stats have to be in our favor to say, listen, you had better, make this a budgeted priority and a priority for your faculty and your staff and your school and your culture, because what we're doing is not working.
Right.
And most Christian schools, even the best of us, have been around since the 60s. There's not too many of us before that. And, you can kind of see throughout American history. So, and then, of course, we all heard through the 60s, 70s, and 80s that obviously our government schools were still very conservative, still very Christian in their approach, blah, 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 which is, obviously the evidence has proven that wasn't true at all. We would just had a lot more Christians who were actually up in front of the classroom.
Right.
But what they were doing was not imparting an immersion of biblical worldview. So now we're seeing this thing play out. So if we don't do something like this, boy, I just can't imagine where we're going to be. And I think, we've got to be out there preaching this and ringing the bells for school heads and for pastors to say, listen, let's start looking at these things seriously and saying what we're doing is not working. So integration as an add-on and teachers completely untrained to do immersion, along with 30 minutes of a sermon or maybe 30 minutes of a youth group, is not working. How many different ways do we need to say that and say, man, this has to be a movement here? I liken it to, maybe we need to write that next book. I don't figure it out, but I'm still in awe in how one book, The Anxious Generation by Jonathan Haidt, how that book so moved through this country and the legislators that, and I know it wasn't just all that, but it was a major ingredient in getting schools to now start banning cell phones or restricting their use. One book, on top of a bunch of other data. And I kind of feel that way in our own circles to say, listen, this has got to be the ding, ding, ding. Hey, we've got to try a different strategy here because this cannot be good for America. This cannot be good enough. Well, what's next for you? What are you working on now? Because I know it's exciting.
Yeah. So got a couple things in the hopper right now. One is a brand new book that's coming out this fall, late summer, early fall, which is the first in a series of books that we're calling the Teach Biblically series. And what we're doing is we're addressing the need for highly accessible, highly practical books about every subject area from within a biblical worldview to equip teachers who may be using secular Christian or Christian curriculum, who may have gone to secular university or even Christian university, to really help them see how to teach their subject area, to look at their subject area, to understand it from within a biblical worldview. So the first one's coming out is Teach Biblically. It's history. And that's coming out this late summer, early fall. And then over the next couple of years, we'll fill it out with all of the major subject areas. What we found was there's a lot of great books, some of them you might even see on the shelf behind me here, about subject areas that are written by Christians that are either really hard to read, are too long, or are not accessible. And really, really good content. So what we're doing is we're taking all the best thinkers and really helping translate that for your average teacher's time, attention span, and needs to really understand their subject and how to live it within a biblical worldview. So that's a biggie. We're also working very soon on book number 2 as a follow-up to Beyond Biblical Integration. We've been training now, my colleague Maggie and I, and then we have some other trainers that work with us. We've been training now on this for 4 years, and really 6 years since the book was published. We have learned a ton. We have developed so much more. So we're looking at taking all of that and putting that into a sequel book that answers the question, I love this, I'm passionate about it, you just whet my appetite. Now what do we do? And to address that issue. And then we have some really fun, just ongoing development of training initiatives and mentorship and just walking with schools over the long term to see biblical worldview immersion become the centerpiece of everything that they do.
Oh, yeah, I love that. Well, long overdue, because as you know, for years and years, we were all working off of about 1 or 2 book models and
Yes.
giving those to our teachers and saying, here, read this. I think you'll get
Which
it.
were great. We're standing on their shoulders.
Yes.
Many of the people that wrote them are good friends of mine. So
That's
I
right.
always
And
want
they're
to honor
good.
and acknowledge the plowing work that they did.
Right. Yep. And good principles there.
Yep.
Principles that stood the test of time. So
Yes.
yes, you need to know the principles that are in this book. And yes, it was written in
Absolutely.
the 1960s or 70s, but the principles have not changed because it was based on
Right.
God's word. You just need to know now, what does that principle, how does that translate into immersion and immersive
Exactly.
experience within your classroom? And how is that going to play itself out on, like you said, your assessments, your lesson plans, the activities you choose?
Rubrics. Yep.
Rubrics, yes, the whole 9 yards. And it should be the way you live your life
Absolutely.
every day. And if you don't succumb to that dualistic mind and that whole approach, you'll be fine here. But if you've
Yes.
already gone down the 2-track road, that's going to be a challenge. What advice would you have for teachers, parents who they want to know more, or they're thinking about this subject, but whether it's knowing more about you and your ministry or just knowing more about this subject, where can they go? What should they do?
Yeah. So the 2 best ways to find out what we do is through summit.org/educators. And it's, a simple place you can go and find out all the things that we do and how we can partner with you as schools or as teachers. Personally, the best place to connect with me, besides where you and I connected, would be on LinkedIn. That's where I'm most active, and I wish I was more active, but that's where you can get a hold of me real easily. And really, I would just say, look at this as a long-term incremental process for you as a teacher to immerse yourself in a biblical worldview as you consider how to do that for your students. So it can just start by changing your information diet. Podcasts like this and others that you can listen to, that you just continually are taking in the good stuff and asking the Lord to show you, I've taken in this good stuff. Now, what does it mean for class next week? What does it mean for my parenting? How can I let a biblical worldview shape everything I do as I live within it?
Yeah, I love that. That's so good. And it's so true, because if you're a lifelong learner or a continual learner, that should be what you're about already. So I know for myself, the more I read, the more I listen to, the more I study, then the better and easier this gets to walk this out. We know that that's just a part of salvation and sanctification. You just haven't arrived. And so you don't get all the answers to the test the minute that you accept Christ. You're working that out, and you're working through it. So why would we think that there's going to be some shortcut here, or that everything's just going to be all of a sudden understood? Well, a great conversation, and we could just go on and on here. I love this. I'm convicted about it. I'm passionate about it. I think it is the answer for what ails us. And so I don't want to put too much pressure on Roger in this book, but I'm telling you, we've got to get out there, and we've got to be passionate about this message. So yeah, let me wrap it up here today. Let me give you 2 chalkboard points for you to consider as a result of our show. Chalkboard point number 1 is just a reminder: students in our government schools are immersed in a worldview. As our guest today noted, from the things hanging on the wall, the classroom content, teaching methods, core values, and so forth, students are immersed in an environment that factors God out and focuses on man. These schools don't struggle with secular integration. If Christian schools expect to compete here and truly raise up graduates who live and impact the culture with the biblical worldview, then we've got to think differently and immerse our students in a biblical worldview from the earliest ages through graduation. Everywhere our children turn, they should find themselves immersed in a God-shaped view of the world. And point number 2 is this: even if a person is saved and knows the truths of the biblical worldview, that doesn't guarantee they'll actually live with a biblical worldview. The research shows that even the nation's most biblically grounded Christians struggle to fully apply scriptural principles in their lives. As I've said before, believing and learning always go hand in hand in the Bible, and there's a reason for that. Living out one's faith takes training and education, continual learning and discipleship from mentors equipped to teach us. We can't expect cultural impact from generations of believers who have never received any formal training in biblical worldview and have never experienced any integration of their faith with what they've learned in school. Listen, education matters. Well, that's our lesson for today, and now you know more. When you know more, you can do more. You can not only think differently, but you can act differently, make a change, live out those convictions, and say no more if you must. Well, thank you again for joining me today on the Clearly Christian podcast, and I trust that now you know more about the difference between immersion and integration, the limitations of our inherited public school model, and the urgent need for deeper worldview formation in our young people. Again, if you like the show today, let us know by following or subscribing. Maybe hit that like button for me, and certainly let others know the show's worth checking out. It makes a difference. I would really appreciate that. Remember, the only way to turn things around in our country is to increase the number of people who hold a biblical worldview and live that out every day. And the greatest hope to get there is Christian education. I'm Dr. Cy Smith, and this has been Clearly Christian.
Thank you for listening to the Clearly Christian podcast with Dr. Cy Smith. Hear more episodes at clearlychristianeducation.com. If you'd like more information about Christian education in your neighborhood, or if you're interested in education opportunities at Mansfield Christian School, or if you agree with Dr. Smith and want to help him in his mission to influence and awaken Christian America, you can send Dr. Smith an email through the clearlychristianeducation.com website. Message him on the Clearly Christian LinkedIn or Facebook page, or call the Clearly Christian Connection line at 419-756-5651. This has been the Clearly Christian Podcast with Dr. Cy Smith on clearlychristianeducation.com, brought to you in conjunction with Mansfield Christian School, a Bryan Media production.